I'd like to welcome James Corbett. James is an Employee Relations Manager and HR Business Partner at Nestle. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks for having me on board for the next hour. As Louise mentioned, I've been at Nestle for some time, primarily employee relations and industrial relations focused roles. And so I guess as part of that responsibility, I have had quite an amount of time involved in some fairly large restructuring projects. So looking forward to sharing some of those experiences, some of the things that have worked well, some things that perhaps not so well, and engaging with you all in this important chat. Thank you.
Thank you. And moving on to Ryan. Ryan Atkins is a HR Director for Kantar Australia New Zealand. So Ryan, if I can hand over to you for an intro.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining in today. I've been 18 months at Kantar, which is a Bain-owned market research company. I joined in peak COVID, and in the first month was asked to retrench 10% of the population virtually. That was interesting and new, but prior to that, I guess I've worked in industries where restructuring and redundancies is an accepted annual occurrence, and somewhere it's poorly understood, exceedingly rare and very frightening. So I've seen a few different contexts where this has taken place.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like to introduce Georgie Chapman. Georgie is a partner at HR Legal. So over to you, Georgie.
Thanks, Louise. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. As Louise said, I'm a partner at HR Legal, and we're a workplace relations and safety firm based out of Melbourne, but servicing clients nationally. And we support employers across the whole host of workplace relations and safety issues and challenges. And certainly the last 18 months has been, and I'm going to use the word that we all hate, unprecedented in terms of the amount of developments, challenges that employers, workplaces, employees have experienced. And we've been providing a lot of support around, the restructuring, change management and redundancy space. And so we really look to support employers to achieve their commercial objectives while managing the legal risks, but ideally moving into that best practice space so that it's, the process is managed as well as possible.
Thank you. So thank you, James, Ryan and Georgie, for joining. Really, really appreciate it. So as the title of the webinar suggests, handling redundancy with care and compassion is a key focus for many organisations. I think there'd be very few people out there that don't know somebody that's been impacted by restructures and has been through this process in the past 12 to 18 months. We know that handling redundancy is never pleasant for anybody, either whether it be an employee that's impacted, a leader or a HR professional involved in managing the process, and considering the impact as well of the pandemic on everybody's well-being in every single aspect of their life, it's never been more important to consider how individuals are supported and managed during the redundancy process, so their experience is as stress-free and as smooth as possible. For those of you that don't know LHH, we're one of the largest talent development and career transition specialists. We work with our customers to provide talent solutions across career mobility, leadership development, coaching, and outplacement. So today we're going to focus on some key themes in relation to redundancies. And I'm really keen to get started with a focus on our first theme around employee engagement. Our research shows that employee engagement during redundancies can vary significantly and is impacted by a number of levers, such as communication, transparency, and support services provided. So my first question's to James. James, what challenges have you faced when trying to maintain employee engagement during a redundancy process? What are some of your kind of key learnings and how have you resolved them?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. Look, I think the first thing to note is, there might be conjecture about change in a particular business unit. There might be external factors like, COVID-19 or other things going on. But despite that, I can say, from experience that, when the announcement or the discussion first happens, it is always a shock. There's no doubt about that. When you are having to have a very challenging discussion with somebody, to let them know that their role is going to be adversely impacted because of some decisions that a business is making, there's always a shock factor. So I think it's really important to acknowledge those emotions that come immediately, as well as perhaps a sense of anger, a sense of distrust or anxiety about the future. So it's really important to acknowledge that. But then I guess in thinking about engagement for people, particularly if there's a long lead time between an announcement that a role is going to when they eventually leave, it's really important to let the individual know what the next steps are for them personally. And quite often you'll have people in different categories. So I was unfortunately recently involved in the decision to close a fairly large food manufacturing site in regional Victoria. And one of the things we found to be very important in maintaining engagement between the announcement and the eventual closure of the doors was to very clearly tailor the approach to the individual audience. So, some people might be quite happy about an announcement like that, particularly if they've had a lot of service and they're approaching retirement, might be an early bonus for somebody, whereas other people are in a very different category and really need to get into the workforce as quickly as possible. And that's where the tailored approach can be important. And that does assist with engaging that particular person that you're dealing with as required by their circumstances.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, especially around kind of that acknowledging that, different groups have different needs, sometimes have different emotions around it. So, do require different emotions. We also came to put some focus on employee well-being. Obviously, well-being is very, very closely interlinked to engagement, and our research shows that mental health is one of the top two concerns, along with motivation, for our HR leaders today. So, question to Ryan, what have you implemented at Kantar, or what have you experienced either at Kantar or elsewhere that's had the most success when it comes to employee well-being and psychological health across impacted employees?
Sure. I think I generally take the view that it's important when you're delivering, difficult news to provide the person with as much structure as you possibly can. Keep it as simple as you can. Know that when you're having a discussion around displacement, redundancy or retrenchment might be the only thing they hear. So in terms of that initial displacement meeting, I consider it a success if the manager can deliver the message, HR can provide the support. But if the individual comes out knowing what money they'll be getting potentially, and that they actually connect with outplacement before they leave the meeting, that for me is success. Everything else is gravy. That can all wait till later. So I'll do some practical things like make sure I convert the severance or potential severance into net months pay. So the person can have a picture in their head of how long I've got before I run out of money. And it could be a good story. Sell outplacement and bring them into the room or introduce them into the chat to make sure that they connect and take that opportunity. I never retrench on a Friday. It's always about creating structure and not giving people the weekend to make terrible decisions. So make sure that you say, okay, go home today, come back tomorrow, and we'll talk about handover. And give them that structure about, well, what are the next steps? The next steps are we will do X, Y, Z. And for different individuals, to James' point, they might want to know the handover straight away, and you can move straight into that discussion. So it's about being prepared for all of those things. Let them know in all your communications that EAP is available for them and their families, and often for 3 months after employment, depending on some vendors. At Kantar, it was not a thing that happened a lot. So people were incredibly shocked, and we didn't have a better than minimum policy in terms of payment. So we costed up and introduced an 8-week floor payment so that, at the very least, you will get 8 weeks plus notice. Now, this was April last year, so not knowing what the employment scenario would be for these people, we felt that that would at least give them a sense of sort of comfort. And as well as the people in the business knowing people were leaving, knowing that at least there was a minimum payment of probably 12 weeks in the hand.
No, thank you. And I think you some really, really interesting and valuable points in there. And I think, you mentioned both kind of EAP and kind of outplacement as, additional support services. And, we know when we speak to a number of our customers, they really understand that level of responsibility that they do hold towards employees. And in some of our recent surveys, over half of HR leaders have actually said that ensuring that they, were a responsible employer was a key reason for engaging support services like EAP and outplacement. So Georgie, from a legal standpoint, I know commitment around employee wellness is probably a grey area, but I'd love your insights in terms of, what do you see and what do you advise working with your customers, either from their challenges or kind of initiatives?
Yeah, I think, workplace health and safety obligations are really important at any stage of the employment life cycle. But, traditionally when we thought about safety, we thought about physical safety, and obviously both from a community perspective, but also the safety authorities' perspective, psychological health and safety and mental health in the workplace are much more at the forefront, particularly after the extraordinary past 18 months that we've all experienced. And I think it's more important now than ever than we're really thinking about that employee wellbeing piece when we're undergoing these sorts of processes. And I think really on a practical level, if, like I said at the beginning of today's session, if we manage these processes well with care, with support, even when they have really challenging outcomes for individuals, I think it's also going to reduce the psychological impact on them on the one hand, but also I'm a lawyer, so I'll always think about the legal risks, the likelihood that there'll be disputes or post-termination claims if they are managed well. So a lot of the things that Ryan spoke to are really great examples, and having that EAP and outplacement. And to James's point about, different audiences, sometimes someone won't be ready to actually reach out to EAP on the first occasion. So, continuing to remind them. And sometimes these processes can be a bit more protracted depending on how big the restructure is or what have you, and going through consultation, redeployment and what have you. So I think that certainty piece is so important from a mental health perspective. It's really as much certainty as you can provide as to what the next steps look like. That can be the antidote to poor mental health. And also, I think, considering what some of the overlaying factors might be or compounding factors for someone's well-being or poor mental health. So, if someone is approaching retirement but wasn't ready to make that step, and so this is bringing it forward, it could be a welcome thing if they have that parachute, but it might not be. And so, trying to support them with other advice, maybe linking in with financial advice through their super fund, those sorts of things. And the other thing I think is really important, both for individuals who are impacted, but also for those who are left behind, is that the acknowledgement of the service of the people who are departing, particularly if you've got long-standing members of staff, because that really goes to those impacted individuals leaving with dignity and with acknowledgement, but also sends a really important message to those who are left behind that the organisation cares about its people. And I think that wellbeing piece for those who are left behind is also really important in terms of how that's managed as well.
Yeah, actually, that actually leads nicely to my next question. And I wanted to shift the focus to kind of those that are left behind, because they're often forgotten about during redundancy processes. And seeing colleagues leave, can be very difficult emotionally. And survivor syndrome is a recognised psychological guilt that can be experienced by those remaining. And if left untreated or unacknowledged, it can have a significant impact on morale, but also performance, engagement, and productivity. In some of the studies that we've kind of undertaken over the last couple of years, we found that 65% of employees have reported that stress has increased as a result of surviving one or more redundancy periods. So question to both James and Ryan, what processes have you seen put in place to help employee engagement for those that remain?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Louise. I think it's really important that the explanation for the rationale for the decision and a clear explanation for that, not just for the people who are negatively impacted in terms of losing their roles, but also those individuals who might be moving roles, moving into a slightly different organisational structure, different responsibilities. That's key, and that goes to the planning that needs to take place before any restructuring process commences. So yeah, a very clear explanation about the rationale for the change can be very important. Making clear what supports will be in place for somebody who perhaps is having a change in their job responsibilities. And I think just management and HR managers who've made these decisions for redeployments or difficult decisions about who stays, who goes, having and making very clear that they have confidence in those individuals to be a success in the way forward for the organisation. But it's very difficult and very tricky. And the other thing I was going to say is I think acknowledging the contribution, and Georgie touched on this, of those who are leaving the organisation is really, really important. I've seen that happen very well. And those individuals should be celebrated for their contribution to the business. And that, I think, can support those who are remaining in the organisation to feel engaged and have a sense of trust that, yes, the organisation has made a challenging decision, but in the circumstances, the right decision for the future of the organisation. So acknowledging those who are leaving, a clear rationale for the change for those who are remaining, and the support and trust and confidence that should play out in those conversations as individuals who remain get to know their new roles, their new responsibilities, new reporting lines, whatever that is, and ensure that they feel supported along the way. I think that they are key.
Yeah, I think that that acknowledgement piece as well really goes to that enforcing the message that it's the role and not the person, because I think human nature, anybody that's been through it or experienced somebody going through it, sometimes it can feel very personal, and it needs to be that message needs to be kind of continually kind of enforced that it's a role decision, not a person decision.
For sure.
Well, Ryan, what about yourself?
Yeah, look, just in relation to the idea that it's the role, not the person, in the displacement meeting, when it's relevant, I will definitely say to the person, ask for their confidentiality throughout the course of the day, because we have a number of other people we need to have a very similar conversation with. And for them, it does give them that sense, oh, it's not me. It is something larger than me. So if you can find a way to insert that into the conversation, you can hopefully remove that, fear and anxiety around what have I done for that person. To what James said about planning, absolutely, and having a compelling why and a clear rationale right from the very start, and have consistency in that communications cascade all the way through the organisation. So, what you ask the business to put together to tell the story of why we're doing what we're doing needs to turn up in the letters that the employees get and the emails that go out, the manager guides that you might produce for the team meetings that occur before the electronic stuff goes out. So you have a consistency of approach in that comms cascade. Transparency and availability of managers. So the comms cascade is all about the same message. Managers available. Where possible, you would have them pre-briefed and in team meetings with their people to share the news. Whether the team's impacted or not, you fill that communications vacuum with what the people need to hear and what is true. So definitely consistency, speed, transparency, and availability would be my things.
Yeah, no, all very, very, very valid points. So we touched on before, and we talked about well-being, that we've talked a lot about kind of expectations for employees, particularly around those like next steps, practical information on salary payout, etc. But another element of expectation can be around that opportunity to stay in the organisation, via redeployment. And in some redundancies, there's a potential for redeployment, but it can really vary in each situation, and often it's not possible. So love to ask you a question, James, around this, around challenges of kind of that you've faced with kind of managing kind of expectations of employees transitioning. I expect in your situation, maybe where you've got shutdowns, the opportunity to redeploy is probably very limited. So would love your insights in how you manage that.
Yeah, no, look, it is, and sometimes employee expectations or thoughts about what might be the next role for them in the organisation doesn't align with what is available and what the business is able to provide. So, again, clear communication about those opportunities. But I think, if I go back to the situation we had in having to close a factory, there was a long lead time between announcement and finally closing the door. So that lots of opportunity and time to I guess, get people into a state of mind where they were able to see, okay, well, this is where I need to go. These are the next steps for me personally, and putting those individuals in contact with the appropriate support to help them. So, if you think about regional towns, very, very challenging. And if you think about the COVID environment as well, very challenging to find quick alternative roles. But certainly, the processes and supports we're able to put in place involve things like helping individuals get their CV up to date. We had some workers who probably never put a CV together in their life. They've had one role in a factory for 25, 30 years and still had a way to go before retirement. So they really needed some one-on-one support to get their resume up to speed. Even interview skills, doing some role playing with individuals about the type of questions that would be asked from prospective employers. Those sort of basic, tangible one-on-one services can be very, very helpful to individuals. We got some very, very strong feedback that was a good thing. And we even went so far as to organise for some employers in the area to come into this particular manufacturing site to offer up some information about how to apply for roles at their sites. And that all of that stuff worked very well. But yeah, just going back to redeployment within the organisation, there should be a process where people feel comfortable and supported to apply for roles. But at the same time, I think given clear feedback if it's not to be fairly quickly, so that they can then move on and work out what is best for them as soon as possible.
Yeah. Ryan, any kind of insights?
Yeah, just around a long lead time with say a factory closure. I did one, I think it would be 20 years ago now, where we were teaching people how to set up Gmail and Hotmail addresses such that they could register with Seek and so on and get that done. And knowing your customer in that scenario is really important. For example, it was a multi-language site, so we did a weekly newsletter and produced it in a number of key languages so that people could quickly sort of understand it. There was nothing to create friction for them to understand what needed to be done, what they needed to do. So yeah, you just have to walk in the shoes of your customers, who are these various employee groups. In terms of redeployment opportunities, when there are practically little to none, I will always share the severance information and introduce outplacement on that first discussion. Let's not waste everybody's time or create additional anxiety. But when there are examples where we have had a range of open and new roles available, you've always got the roles on a piece of paper as part of the documentation you give the individual. Say, here are the roles, the locations, etc. If you have a talent acquisition team, these people should not be forgotten in a restructure. They're a key partner to HR here. You use them to assist the people with applying for jobs, discussing the market, because they will know your industry as well as anybody out there. So really connecting in TA with that whole post process as your partner there. And not often, but you do need to check in with people about how mobile they are and see if that creates any other sort of ideas or opportunities.
I apologise if there's a lot of noise my side. It's decided to have a gale outside my window, so I apologise if there's any noise interference. No, thank you, Ryan, and some really practical advice and points there. Georgie, from a legal standpoint, what are you recommending to your customers in terms of managing employee expectations?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the practical suggestions that James and Ryan have provided actually put you in a good position from a legal perspective. That certainty piece is really important. The consistency of your comms, the good planning is absolutely paramount. So, not only having the reason there, but, how is this going to be conveyed? Providing support to individuals who will actually be conveying the message and having written comms to, reinforce that. So I think a lot of the time in these sorts of meetings, James flagged this off the top, it still comes as a shock, and often they won't always digest everything that you're telling them. So having it there also in a document that they can easily digest once they've left the meeting is really important. I think, around the redeployment piece, as both James and Ryan have said, often there are no opportunities for redeployment. And actually, I think calling it out, it's one of those considerations that will be relevant, to the managing the risk of an unfair dismissal claim. It's going to be front of mind for individuals. So if there aren't any opportunities, actually saying, look, we've really given consideration to this, but this is why. And if there are new roles that are being created in the structure and they're not the right ones, but they might have some sort of crossover, actually explaining why they're not the appropriate roles for direct redeployment, I think can go a long way. Otherwise, if they don't have that information, then they'll, form their own conclusions, and that can give rise to, disputes and legal risks as well. So I think the certainty piece is so important, both on a practical level, but also from a legal perspective. And I think something else I've seen lots of clients do is that they prepare Q&A documents, not necessarily to distribute to everyone, but that people who'll be delivering the messages can, presuppose what some of the common themes might be or the common questions, so that they are, well armed to answer those questions. That the answers provided will be largely consistent, and it just then provides that sort of, I think, consistency and less likely to get disputes or, issues with wellbeing and the like when you're going through these processes.
Yeah, I think, the expectation kind of piece for employees is so many different angles on this when it comes to what happens, do I look for a role externally or internally? And certainly when we kind of see with our customers, they often kind of partner with us to kind of help relieve some of the workload of HR managing these, because we're able to leverage people like career consultants and coaches to really help impact employees think about what's possible. So if it's, if there isn't the right role internally, then maybe not put themselves through the process of going through redeployment, but what is beyond the current role, and help them manage expectations. It's really important.
I'm just going to say, Louise, I think they can be really difficult conversations to have. When perception doesn't connect with reality, it does take a level of sensitivity to have those discussions with people where they're clearly, unfortunately, not going to be the right fit for the role. But the sooner those conversations happen, the better, because it puts the person in a clearer state of mind about what the valid options are, and then can ask the right questions about what support might my employer give me to help me find my next job, given I know that in a month or so I'm going to be without work.
Yeah, and I think that getting them through that, looking at the change curve, similar to a grief curve, it's, helping them kind of process through so they can get on the right track. I think super important. We spoke a lot about, the importance of, communication and transparency. In addition to kind of HR's role, it's equally important that managers and leaders are also prepared to have those, very difficult conversations. And often, they've not got the sufficient experience to manage these. It's even harder now, in a pandemic where we're, working from home and in lockdown. And often these meetings that would have been scheduled, in a face-to-face environment are having to happen in a virtual setting. So, I'd love to kind of understand, maybe kind of question to kind of Ryan first. How are you best equipping your line managers and leaders to kind of manage the process with empathy?
Yeah. Starting with the senior leaders, who generally have known something's coming or been planning it for 6 months or a year. And so their feelings and emotions have all been dealt with, and they've probably moved to a very practical, how do we enact this and get to where the business needs to be in the new shape that we know it's becoming. So they're in a different headspace to the line manager who's just learned they need to lose 30% of their team, right? So part of it is about going to the senior leadership when you're briefing them about the rollout of the program, is to remind yourself, senior leaders, of how you felt when you or someone you know or love has been in this position, and reconnect with that so that you do exhibit empathy rather than being sort of forward focused and action oriented, because that's not what's exactly needed at this time. When you get to line managers, yeah, the capability and sophistication of the line managers and the experience is paramount. Ideally, the line manager does the discussion, but sometimes they're not equipped to do that. And for me, it is about going back to what is the FAQ, what are the questions a line manager will have, what can they and shouldn't they answer, or what should they hand to HR. I will always do a sort of a pre-briefing role play with the line managers, make sure they have a meeting outline, not a script, but sort of this happens and this happens and that happens. Let them know that if they screw up, get it wrong, forget their words, that HR is with them to actually pick that up and carry it along. So they know they don't have to do this by themselves. And that's enough for them to actually often get through their piece themselves. But yeah, real clarity for them, just as much as the individual, about who does what and when, and how to open and conduct and then close that meeting. I'll hand over to James.
Yeah, James, I'm interested to know Nestle.
Yeah, no, I think, Ryan has probably nailed it. I think, practical things like that, one-on-one role playing, crucial, particularly for the manager who hasn't had to have one of these tough discussions before. And then you can play out, some different contingencies that might happen during the meeting. Sometimes it's appropriate, I think, just to get some training or have somebody come in and run a session on dealing with emotions, particularly those, really, really challenging audience conversations with particularly challenging audiences, both individual and groups. And again, coming back to the point we made earlier today about acknowledging the emotion. It's a good thing that people are feeling emotional and upset and angry about the decision. That they are natural responses and reactions, and you need to let those emotions, run their course. But there are some good tips from training courses that I've been involved in acknowledging those things, letting them, letting people sit with those emotions for a period of time, but then steering the conversation into a direction which gets the person thinking about, okay, what are the practical, tangible next steps that I need to think about for my own personal well-being, as well as, down the track, my ongoing employment in some capacity, if that's what they want to do. So, I think all of those practical things are really, really good and really important.
Yeah.
Oh, Louise, I would just add one thing about the cascade of comms, is that you have to strike a balance between giving line managers ample forewarning to process their own emotions and get themselves in a zone where they can have the conversation, and the risk of the information leaking into the broader organisation. And that will differ culture by culture and often manager by manager, but that's absolutely something to consider. And in terms of the role play and brief, letting them know that there's a number of responses, and you'll get one of them, maybe two, but you won't get all of them. But you need to be prepared for stunned silence, anger, tears, etc. And that's probably the most stressful part, is preparing for any number of permutations, even though you're not going to get many of them.
Yeah, no, really good point. And I think that, just focusing on a little bit of training and those kind of practice scenarios can make a really big impact. So last theme that I'd love your input on is actually focusing back on HR leaders. So, we've discussed, HR is responsible for looking out for everyone, but who looks out for HR? So, they're the ones, you're the ones, you have to deal with those tough conversations, you have to deal with the fallout. It can lead to mental strain and fatigue. At LHH, we work with a number of our customers. We provide things like resilience sessions, as well as helping them, deliver news compassionately. But HR also need a psychologically safe space, for themselves, to be able to ask for help and advice, as well as getting some encouragement sometimes to actually practice, some self-compassion. So keen to get, I suppose, all of your insights on this. Maybe we'll start with Georgie. What have you provided, what advice have you provided to kind of customers around HR?
Yeah, I think it's an often forgotten piece. Like you say, HR supporting everyone else, but of course our work health and safety obligations concern all of our workforce from the top down. And often, particularly in those larger restructures, if HR is helping with a number of these conversations, possibly a large volume, that is an extraordinarily difficult process for them to undergo. And so we need to actually acknowledge that, and their leaders need to be providing them space to say, actually, we know this is difficult. Yes, it's a core function of their role, but it doesn't mean that it's just, a suck it up type situation. So, really giving them space for that, and reminding them of the supports that are there for the broader workforce, including EAP and what have you, but also considering what other supports could be provided. And if it's been a particularly challenging process that's been in chain for a long period of time, even though it's just got to the pointy end, perhaps also thinking, what does the next stage look like once the changes have been implemented, and is there an opportunity to provide them some space for wellbeing at that point in time, whether it's some time off, some sort of acknowledgement or recognition or what have you, just to really acknowledge that it has had a huge impact on them. I think it goes a long way, not only in terms of their wellbeing but also their future engagement with that organisation and what have you, because there does need to be that recognition. So it's a really important piece of the puzzle, and one that I think does get overlooked.
James and Ryan, kind of any?
Sorry, Ryan. I was going to say, without pushing it down somebody's throat, making sure they're aware that there's always somebody to speak to, whether it's an employee assistance program or a colleague. People should. There needs to be an opportunity, post these large restructures, and where you've got, a fairly detailed dates and times to comply and to have a conversation. That can be a pretty emotionally and draining process to go through. So debriefing is key to that. I think Ryan and I were joking the other day about the importance of there being, some alcohol involved from time to time, not to celebrate a difficult conversation, but just to support your colleagues and just to maybe have a drink or a beer or something and say, well, share experiences, share thoughts, discuss what the next steps are. You've got to be able to download. They're emotionally grueling experiences sometimes, particularly the volatile audiences. So the support from your colleagues is key. And I think Georgie tapped onto something which is important. It can be really well appreciated if senior management acknowledge HR, who in many respects are responsible for putting the communications together, developing the key documents, from payroll all the way through to making announcements and putting in place programs to support employees. Some acknowledgement from senior management can go a long way for a job well done, I think.
Yeah, James, agree. I mean, HR carry the bucket of preparing for all these emotional responses for managers and staff, and also all the scheduling components, right? So the preparation is really important for doing practice. I've fake retrenched my current team a few times each now as we've practiced, having those discussions and different reactions. It's important to do, and sometimes fun. But the run-throughs are important, and also to say on the day, what's our process when things go wrong? We might have to. Who do we escalate to if the scheduling blows out, or we have a really strong reaction from someone, extreme response? We do let the team know that it's okay and there's enough flex and we have support, outplacement or whatever, to help us through that, and let them know that it doesn't need to be 100% perfect, and absolutely debrief. Get together at the end of the day and the end of the process and speak through the experiences, much like you would with the managers, right? And give feedback and say, hey, you did well there, and so on and so forth. And, great job, well done. We didn't see that coming. And just blab like I am now, and let people blab about it until they've finished. I think these experiences are really important to forging a team culture for HR teams as well. These are big events and they're important events, and if done well, and it's a terrible job, but all we can do as HR practitioners is do a great job at a terrible thing. It does really bring a team together and form some really strong team cultures as a result. If there's any upside to this.
Yeah, no, I think some great insights, and I've had some great learnings as well, kind of listening to kind of your tips and processes and how you handle them. So that brings us to the end of our Q&A between the four of us. Now I might just take a look at the Q&A that's come from the audience. Okay. So Laura, is that just go into the Q&A? Okay. So let's have a question first from Paul Wood. So he works in HR, so he works in New Zealand, and the consultation process is different than Australia. How early in the process would you recommend engaging both EAP and outplacement? Would you do that prior to discussion or after consultation? I think James and Ryan, you kind of both touched on that in your...
Yeah, we would often have an outplacement support provider, so someone from Lee Heath Harrison available on the day of announcement. So there might be an initial announcement to a large group, then individual discussions, and then the opportunity for employees to meet with an outplacement support person, immediately after the shock of receiving the news and as it impacts them. And then that can be very, very helpful to allow the employee to understand, okay, well, there are supports in place to help me deal with the immediate next steps and the broader long-term steps that I need to take for myself.
Another question is, what is your view on the employee having a support person in the consultation meeting? So in the event that kind of person kind of lodges a claim and kind of workforce compensation views this, as procedural fairness, what would your advice be? Maybe that's one for Georgie.
Yeah, look, obviously in consultation obligations and the like, there can be the obligation to consult with employees and their representatives. So often that's a union. But as to having a support person, which is really a person there for moral support, I think it's, if you've got policies or anything in your enterprise agreement that requires it, always consider that. But I think in larger scale restructures, redundancy scenarios, actually having a support person in every meeting can actually derail the process a little bit, because if you're trying to organise a support person and then they say that person's not available, and then that can actually become counterproductive. With all that being said, if there's someone who has a history of mental health issues or is particularly vulnerable and you're aware of that, it might be something that you offer, but it's certainly not a flat out legal requirement, and it won't always necessarily be the right approach to take. It can actually frustrate the process, and it can, people can, if they're invited to a meeting and it says you can bring a support person, and that pricks up their ears, and then they try to avoid the meeting. Not always the case, but it certainly happens. So you do have to consider that broader context. Yeah,
if I get asked to bring a support person, I'm being disciplined or fired. Let's not do that. Having said that, I've had situations where somebody's had chronic health issues and I've had a nurse on site because the happy news of the massive payment 2 years before retirement, we thought might actually, cause a heart attack. So we've done that, but generally a support person in the meeting, no.
Cool. So I have a question around redeployment. I suppose what could be external, but what would you consider, let me phrase that again. What should you consider when looking at suitable comparable roles? So when you've spoken to, I suppose, impacted employees and there are potential redeployment options on the table, what would you typically look at?
I think firstly you need to look at the person's current job responsibilities. and see how if it will tie up or line up with the opportunity available elsewhere in the organisation, their performance in their role, and some insight perhaps from their manager about, there might be some insights about what that person was considering doing in their next role, what their career aspirations are. And sometimes those things will line up with redeployment opportunities, and other times they won't. So that's important. And it might be that, when somebody is advised that their position will be made redundant by a certain date, sometimes you have to have the challenging chat to say, look, as far as we're aware, there are no other suitable roles for you at this point in time. However, please, if you see a role that's being advertised internally within the company that you think you'd be interested in applying for and a good fit, please let us know. Please apply. So there's an onus on the employee as well during that time to look at those opportunities. But if they don't exist at the time, well, you've got to be clear and upfront with the person.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add to that, from an unfair dismissal perspective, if this person is protected from unfair dismissal, one of the relevant considerations is whether there are opportunities at a lower level of status or pay. So often people might make the assumption, oh, there is that lower level, but they wouldn't want that because it would mean their REM goes down and they've got less responsibility. But there's certainly cases where a failure to offer that is found to be a failure to give regard to reasonable opportunities for redeployment. So it's just something to bear in mind, because it can trip people up.
Yeah.
And from a business planning perspective too, it's good to take a position on things like people coming back and saying, what if I drop to a day a week for the next 6 months? People can be quite creative in coming up with things that you've not thought of. If you do this enough and you build your toolkit, but you're going to have to, ideally before the process, go to the business and say, when people come with this, could it work? Or if not, why not? Mm-hmm. So deal with those issues quickly.
Next question, probably to Georgie, but James and Ryan, you might have input in this as well. When there's a situation that the managers are also impacted, but there needs to, obviously that there's they've got to also notify their employees. Have you got any input in terms of best practice around how that's managed?
Yeah, it does happen, and it's a very delicate situation, obviously, but you need to be able to, on that clarity piece that we talked about earlier, really important that you're able to have that conversation. And then if conversations have to be had with the team, whether it's that person leading the conversation or in conjunction with HR, you need to feel confident that that person will be able to. And if not, then the conversations might need to be had without them present. But I think it's one of those things about managing the confidentiality aspect that Ryan spoke to earlier. If there's going to be, if they're going to then go and tell their team, my position's redundant, that's going to really derail the process. So again, the planning of it all and making sure that you're ordering it so that you can try and contain the messaging and make it as consistent as possible.
And I'm presuming if that manager impacted didn't want to be the communicator, then they would have that right to talk to HR or the senior manager to take over that communications.
Yeah, look, I think you've got to give it real consideration, because obviously that is an extraordinarily taxing position to be in when they're dealing with the impact on themselves as well. And if that could then impact how well the messages are delivered, then I think, actually consider whether they're the right person to be giving the messaging.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my experience, if the managers have sufficient time to digest their own news, generally the vast majority of those managers will insist upon delivering the message to their team members the next day or the day after. I don't recall any ever saying, I'm not up for this, but it can happen.
So the question around environments where you've got a number of restructuring activities that happen year on year, and I suppose the challenges around kind of managing kind of employee motivation in a group that's just been through so many of those rounds, like any kind of actions to kind of help maintain in those types of workplaces.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, if change is the norm and the reality, then that can be, you may not necessarily know when the next hit's going to be and what the impact of that change is going to be, but I guess preparing people to ensure that they set themselves up for success and to do the best encourage people to do the best they can do in their role. That's all you can do. But I think there is, it does feel as if we've moved into an environment where, restructuring is commonplace and does happen more regularly as, consumers and customers for businesses change. Businesses need to change their structures to suit the environments that they operate in, but it's tricky and it's a hard thing to have to go through something like this year on year, no doubt.
I think the current environment where we've got, a lot of change, irrespective of restructuring, but change in our lives in terms of how we navigate the COVID pandemic. I think some of the things that we encourage clients to consider implementing could also, really from that mentally healthy workplace perspective. So I think one of the things is, which we've already talked about, is acknowledging when things are challenging. So it's not just assuming, well, they just have to get on with it and we're not going to talk about some of the difficult things that have been going on, but also implementing things to really foster a mentally healthy working environment, making sure that our leaders are actually monitoring health of employees. So if they see actually a few people in this team are really struggling, we don't just keep going, we actually, start conversations around that, but also putting in place programs that can be great for engagement, whether it's, reward and recognition things, and they don't have to be huge gestures, but it's just little things that keep people going and feel engaged in the organisation and motivated, even though there are these challenges happening in parallel. I think they can go a long way to help.
I've got a question around if any of you've got experienced in situations where redundancies are happening as a result of outsourcing. So in this situation, there's not it might be happening, but it might not. So any kind of recommendations around, how do you make sure you involve people, with some transparency, but you don't yourself know how it's going to evolve? Any recommendations around that?
Yeah, we're going through something similar to that at the moment, where not all of the outcomes are completely clear, but we have made a decision to communicate that there is a process underway, that there will be some changes, there will be some job losses in a particular area of our business. And the reason we've gone out and been transparent at this point early on in the decision-making process is because essentially information would get out anyway. So I think sometimes it is better to be on the front foot to say, look, yes, there is a review underway for a particular division or department. We are still working through that. We will regularly communicate with you and give you updates on how that project is progressing. And when we're at a point in time where we can communicate the outcome, we will. But again, that does result in stress levels increasing. It does result in lots of questions about, what it means for me, a lot of conjecture about, who might stay, who might go, what sections will be remaining. But it does also allow people to get their headspace to a point where they are at least considering the prospect that the change might impact them directly, and therefore become very interested in the next communication and what it will mean. But it does mean also that HR need to be very, very prepared for all of those questions that you may not have answers to at a particular point in time. But regular communication, regular updates, I think, are key for those situations.
Yeah, I'm supporting an IT team from Sydney to Singapore, and we needed 6 to 12 months notice because we needed their help to make it happen. So, consider retention bonuses, because you need the IP to stay, in the business for that to be successful, and it's worth that investment quite often to do that. And it's taxed nicely too at the end.
I've probably got time for one more question. So any tips and advice on delivering that impacted conversations virtually?
Turn off the beach behind you. We've had to say that. Quick one from me, I know we're running out of time, is I always want outplacement in the next room and I bring them into the individual. I can't do that virtually. So I'll say, look, you might get some phone calls today once news gets out or whatever, but the last 3 digits of your outplacement consultant's phone number is ... If you see this number and that's the only call you answer today, apart from your manager doing a check-in, answer that call, right? Because I really think that the whole purpose is to talk about the financial support and the job search support. And so virtually that's the way we've come up with to encourage people to connect.
Really good advice.
Yeah, I think that that's fantastic advice, Ryan. And that check-in from the manager is really important. Whereas if we're all in the physical workplace, you'd be able to see that person and how they're coping after if they remain in the work site. We can't do that when people are remote. So I think making sure there is that check-in, and the manager might have a lot on their plate and having to do a lot of these meetings and what have you, but it is really, really important just for that well-being perspective.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd say is, don't expect it to go to plan. The day you're going to announce will no doubt be the day that someone's got to do a late drop off at childcare or is not well. And so there's always going to be those unknowns, and you just got to roll with it and work out the next appropriate time to have that teams.
Run a lead report before you do anything.
Exactly.
So we're almost at the top of the hour. So sorry we didn't get through every question. Thank you for submitting them. Thank you to James, Ryan and Georgie for joining today. I think we've got some really, really valuable practical insights. So thank you for taking the time. And with that, and thank you for everybody that's joined. So we'll wrap this up.